Okay, I'm sure we'll have more colleagues joining, but again, a big and warm welcome to everyone in this room to a new EUNIC online public debate. This time we're talking about the cultural and creative industries in sub-Saharan Africa. Just at this point, a note that if you're interested in more EUNIC webinars, please check in our landing page on webinars and sign up for our newsletter. We will have other topics coming up in the near future that might also be relevant to you in this room here. This webinar, we're co-hosting it together with IFA, Institute für Auslandsbeziehungen, Institute for Cultural Relations, a German organization based in Stuttgart, and also a EUNIC member. And without further ado, at this point, I already hand over to Sarah Wittmeier from IFA, who will give some warm words of welcome. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Gitte. Well, dear Gitte, dear colleagues and distinguished speakers, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on behalf of Sebastian Korber, our Vice Secretary General. Unfortunately, Sebastian cannot be here today, so please accept his apologies. He sends his warmest greetings to you all. Cultural and creative industries are a strong driver for economic and societal innovation. An integrated approach of civil society, arts, and the economy for cultural and creative industries, which include creativity, cooperation, and transnational platforms of exchange, are a central part of international cultural relations as we understand them. Participation, ownership, and capacity building are in this context central aspects of cooperation. In many African countries, cultural and creative industries are supported by EU member states and the European Union as a whole to foster development and international cultural exchange. Due to the high number of countries, international players, different subsectors and activities, it is very difficult to identify gaps and local needs for new and additional funding schemes. A mapping of ongoing initiatives is crucial for the conceptualization and implementation of new programs. To this end, to get a better picture of the situation, IFA conducted this project within its research program, Culture and Foreign Policy. In this program, experts examine current topics of international cultural relations and formulate recommendations for practical use. We are convinced that we need research which examines the status quo of international cultural relations and includes the views and needs of partners and partner countries to better implement foreign cultural policy. We are very happy and thankful to EUNIC to be able to share and discuss our research findings here at this online debate. And before handing over again to Gitte, I would like to thank the two experts of IFA's research program, Pedro Afonso and Kimani Nyogu, for their excellent work and dedication to this research project. Thank you very much for sharing your findings and expertise with us. I'm looking forward to an inspiring discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So again, just to give you an outline of this webinar, we've planned 1.5 hours. Kimani and Pedro will give a short overview of the study they conducted and findings and recommendations, after which we will launch into a discussion with panelists that are joining us from the African Union and other organizations, EU and also on the African continent. And then we'll open up for Q&A. So please feel free to use the chat to ask questions, to note your remarks. And I hope we'll have a lively discussion in the second part of this webinar. So Kimani and Pedro are the authors of this study. Kimani is the executive director of the Twaweza Communications Limited, an arts, culture, and media institution based in Nairobi. He holds a PhD in linguistics from Yale University, has taught at Kenyatta University, and has published widely in the field. And Pedro Afonso is a Brazilian musician and consulting working across the cultural, creative, and development sectors. He holds an MA in International Relations and Cultural Diplomacy from Furtwangen University in Germany. And he has expertise including the role of creative clusters on local development, cultural governance, and cultural policy making. So Pedro and Kimani were commissioned by IFA to conduct a study. And with that, without further ado, I'll hand over to you guys to share some of your findings from the study.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? So it's a great pleasure to be here presenting this webinar this morning. Kimani and me, we would like to thank IFA and would like to thank EUNIC for giving us the space to share our research and to allow us to have this discussion, which I believe it's going to be very fruitful this morning. So as our colleagues Sarah and Gita mentioned previously, Kimani and I, we were commissioned by IFA to conduct this research within this topic of cultural and creative industries supporting initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa. And obviously this is a very big task, and we needed to set in partnership with IFA which objectives we would like to achieve with the research in order to reach the result that IFA was expecting, that we thought also that could be interesting for the research. So the first objective of the research was to identify exclusively cultural and creative industry supporting programs, either funded or implemented by the European Union, by a European Union member states, cultural institutions, and also non-EU states cultural institutions. The second objective was to determine the reason why and how are cultural and creative industries programs funded in the sub-Saharan, African sub-Saharan region. The third, we set to identify the sectors which mainly receive funding, and if there are thematics overlaps in terms of funding, in terms of resources being transferred to the sub-Saharan African region. The fourth objective was to understand and discuss the policy context in which these activities related to the sector are undertaking, so that we could perceive the connections between the programs and the policy making process from the European Union, from the United Nations, and also from the African Union. The last one was to give a set of policy recommendations for future foreign policy interventions in the region, so that we could base mostly the German Foreign Office and also other institutions that are already working or that are planning to work in the region.
So, because cultural and creative industries is such a broad area of work, the research recognized that these areas and programs do present a mix of opportunities and actions that can be framed as international cultural relations or cultural diplomacy and so forth. So different terminologies are utilized within the cultural and creative industries. And for us to be able to pin this down, we developed certain criteria that would then guide the research. And so our research utilized the UNCTAD broad framework for cultural and creative industries in its report, the UNCTAD report. And so we were looking at cultural and creative industries that are targeted by the various institutions funded from the European Union and so on. So that was a major consideration, is cultural and creative industries target in the programming work. we also recognized that there are numerous programs. And so we decided that a critical criteria for us would be to look at the regional programs, whether those programs are focused at sub-Saharan Africa in its entirety, or within the connections between sub-Saharan Africa and other global regions, such as the Caribbean islands and so on. And also whether the programming is intra-regional. So for example, is the program implemented within the Southern African region, whether it's Western African region, Eastern African region, or whether they are cross, programming between the various regions. Then another important criterion that we utilized was really looking at programs that are implemented within the last 5 years. And the purpose for that periodization was to be able to see whether there are particular trends in the programming. And so we looked at that period, so that programs that are very, very recent were excluded from our work. We also were interested in whether they have impact, whether that impact is short-term and long-term. And for that criterion, we depended on the statements that are coming from our literature review. Do the program implementers see the program as having had an impact? And if we came across that, whether it is in qualitative or quantitative form, then that program was incorporated in the research work.
A very brief complementation of the point number 5 about impact. It's important also to mention that we didn't evaluate any program. We were based on evaluation already developed by the funders and implementers, so that we could use it as a source. So we didn't added any value. We didn't judge any of these programs. We took into consideration what of the evaluations of these programs were already saying. And if you have already read the study, or if you would like to read the study, you will perceive that we created a criteria box in the first couple of pages, so that you can go deeper and understand how did we apply this methodology, saying what is this research about and what is this research not about. So
operated as additional programs, so that if you have pilot programs, that those ones came in as additional programs in the research report.
So based on the criteria and on the objectives we had, the main findings, we divided them into 5, because this was our objective, the number of objectives we had. Being the first one, the diversity of actors and the diversity of programs. We have found a number of 24 programs and projects that were suitable within area, and then we assimilated these programs that were implemented in the last 5 years, but there were also programs who have been implemented for more than 5 years, but they are still ongoing. They are very long-term programs that we needed to include as well. And in terms of partners, in terms of program implementers, then we found that, for instance, the Alliance Française, Institut Français, the British Council, at that time Britain was still within the EU, the organizations from Switzerland, from Holland. So basically we covered the main cultural institutions from Europe, in addition to naturally the European Union. And all this number of organizations and this number of programs, 24 programs and projects. They target 32 countries. And mostly these countries were target given the historical linkage, historical connection. So the British Council would naturally target English-speaking countries, French would naturally target French-speaking countries, so on and so forth. However, we found a couple of gaps, for instance, in countries that have other languages being spoken, such as Portuguese. There is a new project we included from the Camões Institute, but it's still at its beginning. So there are, if you read the report, you perceive there are areas which are not so widely covered. In terms of main countries receiving either funds or support, we found that Nigeria, it's one of them. South Africa, it's another one. Kenya, it's another one. Senegal, it's another one. And somehow Congo, it's another one. So we have these countries as the main platforms of entrance to the continent. And through these countries, the actions are held in neighborhood countries or within the regions. For instance, Kenya, it's the door to reach the East Africa region. Nigeria is the door to reach the West Africa region. So these countries are really receiving most of the influx of information and also financial research. The range of CCI sectors that we found, we used the UNCTAD classification, and the UNCTAD classification, it's very broad, and we found out that all these sectors have received funding or support. And here we found out there are many overlaps, because sectors, for instance, the music sector, the audiovisual sector, and the visual art sectors, in a way, are the ones who are receiving and concentrating most of the research being transferred. On the other hand, there are some other sectors which are still practically untouched, that are still in the way to be assisted. These are, for instance, the gaming sector, that in these last 5 years, it's beginning to become one of the targets. The designing sector, and then by design, I mean design very broadly, design of processes, designs, interior design, visual design, social design is a sector that is still lacking support. And also the intra-mobility within the sub-Saharan Africa region. It's a framework that we perceived it's still basically untouched because of the structural problems that the region presents that make programmatic commitment in this area, in these sectors that require mobility, a bit harder. In terms of intervention, findings number 4, we have divided interventions into main branches. The first one, sector-oriented interventions. These are interventions target one sector in particular. For instance, the music sector, the visual arts sector, and we also have the general interventions. These are interventions that take into account, for instance, human rights, women rights, empowerment, youth empowerment, and these programs, they welcomed a broad range of sectors within. And if you read the study, you will also acknowledge that we are saying usually this word, that we have a supermarket of terminologies that are used. So you will find mostly capacity building, both in the sector-oriented and general intervention. You will find infrastructure, both physical and digital infrastructure being held. We will find networking. You will find resignification of colonial period, and the list of interventions, the terminologies that are used, it's really broad. Policy context, we also perceived very clearly there is an enormous presence of the Sustainable Development Framework from the United Nations. There is also a considerable presence in the narrative, in the program's scopes and objectives of the EU regulations and legislations, even when these programs are not funded through the European Union. They are country funded programs. And we also notice that in addition to these intersections from the United Nations and from the European Union, countries have their own objectives. So they design programs based on the need to amplify their own agenda and also using the local need as a platform to give significance to the program. In terms of gaps here, we found that there is a space for inclusion from the African Union and, for instance, the African Development Bank narratives that go beyond the sustainable development narratives. Kimani will be able to talk a little bit more about it, but these were basically our main findings. And now we go to the recommendations.
Yes, indeed. After the findings, obviously we needed to be able to come up with recommendations that would then strengthen the cultural and creative industries programming in sub-Saharan Africa. And, you know, we found that there is need really to look at the contexts on the continent. That means that most of the programming ought to be preceded by research in terms of really harvesting the knowledge that has been that exists in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as previous work that has been done on that particular area or in that particular area, so that our programming is driven from local needs and local priorities, and that we are not also duplicating work that is being done. So identification of local needs to build a bottom-up approach and programming was viewed by the research as a critical recommendation. And that those programming, although funded from the North, ought to be based really on local agendas, or at least some dialogue between the country needs, you know, in the North, as well as the needs on the continent. The research also found that the program managers in sub-Saharan Africa actually also work as cultural translators, and they feed into strategy. They are not, they ought not to be seen just as implementers. They ought to be seen really as interpreting the local context for enhancement of strategies and the design of programs. So a key recommendation coming out of this research is really to seize the opportunity to get close to local context and local needs and local priorities and so on. Now, the research also found that there are many opportunities to diversify funding for cultural and creative industries. And one area really relates to intellectual property rights. The research found that in many cases, intellectual property regimes in the North are quite strong, whereas they are very weak in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet we know that in the process of implementing programs, there are moments when there are innovations emanating from the program work. And the research really recommends that IPRs, intellectual property rights, be viewed as a possible way of funding creative, cultural and creative industries by strengthening the policy framework of IPs in sub-Saharan Africa. Many of our countries in sub-Saharan Africa were seen as lacking in frameworks for intellectual property, or if they exist, they are still very, very weak. So that capacity development is important, and not just in terms of policy, but also to help the practitioners themselves take advantage of those rights. Then there is the issue of content distribution as a possible way of really funding the sector. To expect, for example, products from sub-Saharan Africa to compete with on YouTube on the number of users with products from for example, China is sometimes asking too much, because the existing platforms tend to be driven by audience, consumption. And the research therefore recommends that we need to come up with alternative content distribution mechanisms that can better protect the creative sector in sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of program design, the research recommends very strongly that there be shared ownership of programs, so that the beneficiaries or the program implementers in sub-Saharan Africa own the programs, even if those programs are conceptualized in Europe. And the way they own this is that we build into the program an initial mapping of the various activities, the various organizations that exist on the continent, the various players that exist on the continent, and that they provide input from the onset, and that they are not just implementers. Also to view the short-term programs, like the one-year programs, as ladders to longer programs, so that we are learning from the shorter projects and building onto larger impact, so that the shorter programs are not seen to be an end in themselves, but they benefit from the cumulative efforts over time. The research also really recommends rather strongly that we build co-creation and co-curation opportunities by really allowing for more flexible granting of funds. So if you have conditional grants, you also support co-curation with Africa and Europe or other institutions that are involved. The need to build capacity in program administration, so that we have shared ownership, really building capacity on the continent in terms of program administration, program financing, and so on, so that our institutions also gain experience in administration as well as in sub-granting. We found very, very few organizations in sub-Saharan Africa involved in sub-granting. And I think this is a huge opportunity for our institutions to be involved in sub-granting. The research again found that there is really need, and I think that Pedro has mentioned this, to increase the diversity of sectors by doing cross-sector, co-productions, filmmakers working with fashion designers, working with musicians, and so forth and so on. This hybridity of cross-sector work becomes very, very important. And of course, again, cross-sector as well as cross-nation, cross-continental. Then the fact that we didn't find a lot of programming that appears to pay attention to green and sustainable programming, so that can we, as we work in fashion, can we be conscious of the fact that we are building a sustainable environment, that we are very conscious of a green environment in terms of design, in terms of organizing festivals, and that is actually embedded from the beginning in terms of program conceptualization. In certain situations, the research came across expectation that organizations in Africa apply alongside an organization based in Europe, so that there is an expectation of co-application, and yet we didn't come across many opportunities for matchmaking between the organizations based in sub-Saharan Africa and the organizations based in Europe. So the research recommends that in situations where core applications are expected, a matchmaking effort be initiated right at the onset, so that the potential partners build confidence, build trust, build a relationship before they apply as is expected in terms of the expectations of the grant-making organization. Now, another finding, another recommendation that comes out, again, I think that Pedro has mentioned this, relates to the policy context in which we work. Our research found that there are many opportunities to work within the framework provided by the African Union, because the African Union has over the years done some work in this area, but we didn't find a lot of alignment between the programs that are being implemented with the aspirations of the African Union. If that alignment is there, it is just coincidental, other than very strongly deliberate. So the research recommends rather that there is need for very purposeful and deliberate alignment of programming within the framework of the African Union, and that there are also opportunities to democratize, the process of application. I think democratization of programs can be done at so many levels, and I think that again comes out very strongly that sub-Saharan Africa is multilingual, and one of the ways of democratizing the applications is to allow for other languages to be visible in the applications, and that you democratize it even further by working with think tanks that are on the continent, whether those think tanks are, for example, the Creative Economy Working Group in East Africa, or others like Arterial Network and others that exist on the continent as think tanks, and really benefiting from the knowledge that these think tanks have given, and supporting finally the regional economic commissions, so that we are also working within frameworks that exist in sub-Saharan Africa. I think that provides a summary of the recommendations. Again, if you read the report, you'll find many more recommendations that can help enhance programming in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you very much. I think there was a lot of input and a good summary of what you've been looking at and what you've derived from that. A lot of the points that you raise, bottom-up approach, adjusting activities to local needs, sound very familiar also, not only from my own work on the continent when I was stationed in Kinshasa, but also from what we're trying to do here with our programs, such as the project European Houses of Culture. And I wanted to use this opportunity because there was a question in the chat box. Yes, we're recording this, this webinar, and we will make it available afterwards. So if you don't feel comfortable with being seen, then you can also turn off your camera and switch your name to something that is unrecognizable. So just so you know. Now, without much further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. We're very honored to have Madame Cisse Mariama Mohamed with us. She's the Director of Social Affairs at the African Union. We're also joined by Giorgio Ficcarelli, who heads the Culture and Intercultural Dialogue section here in Brussels at the European Commission in the Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development. Giorgio has worked in Uganda, for instance, and many other countries in his career. I'm also very happy to have Emanuela Gregorio join us from the African Development Bank. And Emanuela is an economist with a focus on fashion and gender. She works at the Office of the Special Envoy of Gender at the African Development Bank, based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. We have Peter Kettner, a representative of Germany. He's head of strategy and planning at the Culture Department of the German Federal Foreign Office. And Joy Mboya, the manager and director of the GoDown Art Center in Nairobi, a leading nonprofit multidisciplinary arts facility in Nairobi, Kenya. Joy is also a performer and cultural activist. She has served on the governing council of the Kenya Cultural Center, which oversees the Kenya National Theatre. So we have a lot of expertise and experience in the room. Joy, if you don't mind, I would like to start with you. As a practitioner on the ground, as we say, what are your experiences with these manifold culture and creative industries programs from different actors from the global north? What are challenges and what do you see are maybe the most important of the recommendations that Pedro Afonso and Kimani Njogu mentioned for your own work?
So thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. No, thank you very much. I think firstly, congratulations to Professor Kimani Njogu and Pedro Afonso for this mapping and analysis. I think it is both timely and actually congruent with ongoing critical discourses that are taking place in the cultural sector globally. And I think some of these, we know them very well: cultural restitution, looking at expanding cultural canons, cultural diversity, and so on. But the aspects of the mapping, I think, that most capture my attention, and I will therefore repeat and endorse what you have already presented, are those that urge us to recognize a changing African CCI landscape and to really make an effort to understand the sector's inner life. And then subsequently, this compels us, I think, to consider the significance of these changes, of these developments, vis-a-vis former and current strategies and support and exchanges with the EU. So for example, and Professor Kimani has stated this, and so has Pedro, I think you say that there is no deliberate programming connecting the African Union recommendations for the sector, not only in relation to the SDGs, but also in relation to integration of IP rights, training and educational systems, etc., or even the use of local languages. And you also talk about there is no programming with advocacy groups or think tanks that engage the private sector or the government in pursuit of sectoral reforms, policy review, implementation for budgets, for culture, etc. I think that these examples begin to give us a glimpse into the changes that have been taking place in the past 2 decades and continue to take place within the CCIs on the African continent. I think that some have termed this time the Wakanda century, and what that means is that alongside the many problems that threaten the continent, there is a discernible movement towards an African flowering and an eventual African peak. And of course, this will be a long journey, but I think that in these features, we see challenges and opportunities for CCIs at this time, and I'll quickly share 3 of them. I think the first one, which has been mentioned again and again by Prof, is localization. There is a propulsion towards local ownership, local empowerment, local participation, local engagement. And in relation to CCIs, this manifests in calls and efforts by local practitioners for local funding sources. You're looking at local philanthropy beginning to build up, for the strengthening of local cultural institutions, the erection of local cultural infrastructure, the development of local content, local narratives, a growing local consumption of the same. And indeed, the centrality of culture for nation making becomes even more advocated for directly and indirectly. The second one, I think, is this notion of expansion. Africa's CCIs have been growing steadily and consistently over the past 2 decades. I mean, when we look at Kenya, the CCIs here, of course, are driven by youthful creativity, and they have, on average, registered better growth performance than the main economy over the past 5 years. And this is according to government annual economic surveys. So there's a real opportunity for innovative investments and funding of CCIs, a need to focus on bridging gaps and under development parts of the value chains, the provision of incentives that will move the sector from nascency, a need for data collection and management and monitoring for effective sector planning. And then the third one and the last one is this idea of coherence. In the last 20 years, cultural practitioners across many African nations are getting better at pulling together, at leveraging their collective efficacy to build partnerships and networks among themselves, but also with the private sector and with government in order to strengthen the operating environments of CCIs. And this is with respect to policy, legislation, and knowledge exchange. I think the big challenge here is how to realize effective, stable mechanisms and frameworks for implementation and sustained engagement so that the CCIs display coherent development. So going forward, I think that these emergent aspects of a steadily growing CCI in sub-Saharan Africa must now be brought into the discussions of funding partnerships and supporting strategies between the EU and the continent. And perhaps the efficacy and success of such partnerships may very well be dependent on the extent to which or how well sub-Saharan Africa's CCI landscape is correctly observed and how the EU agendas and objectives also genuinely speak to this new reality. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this important input. I would like to turn to the African Union, because that's also something that Joy mentioned, and we've heard it before in the presentation of the study. Cisse, Mariama, Mohamed, what programs or what frameworks exist within the African Union for the promotion of arts and culture? And how does the African Union coordinate these programs with EU member states, but also with cultural organizations on the ground?
Thank you so much. I would like at the once to express our gratitude to the organizer of this important webinar for the invitation accorded to the AUC and for us to contribute to this important conversation on creative economy. You will agree with me that the creative economy on the African continent is gaining center stage, and we at the African Union Commission are working hand in hand with our member state and Pan-African cultural institution to promote the development and growth of this important sector. First, allowed me to allude the main AUC initiative on the creative economy. We have the AU Plan of Action on Cultural and Creative Industry, which was adopted in 2008, and it's aimed at assisting and guiding AU member states in developing their national policy instrument to galvanize and promote the cultural and creative sector. In 2007, the Republic of Zimbabwe proposed that this important continental instrument be revised to incorporate contemporary trend on the creative economy, as well as issues related to intellectual property rights, which were missing in the earliest document. The revision of the AU Plan of Action on Cultural and Creative Industries has now been concluded, and it's awaiting validation by member states. The second is the African Audiovisual and Cinema Commission, which was established to promote the development of the cinema and audiovisual industry on the continent. Its statute has been adopted by the AU Assembly, and it's awaiting ratification by member states to enter into force. The Republic of Kenya offered to host the temporary secretariat of these AU specialized agencies. The Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers and the government of Kenya were very instrumental for the establishment of the African Audiovisual and Cinema Commission. We also have the Protocol of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which entered into force, and its secretariat was launched in Accra, Ghana recently. The operationalization of this office will be critical to the creative economic sector, mainly with regard to the expansion of the creative economic sector market and the movement of artists. We have also the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization, which was adopted in 2016 by the AU Assembly. The Republic of Tunisia is hosting its office in Tunis, and the process of operationalization is underway. Purpose stated has been signed by 4 member states, and no ratification has been achieved so far. The statute will enter into force after they receive by EU Commission of 15 instrument of ratification. PEPO will be a crucial institution in guaranteeing that the intellectual property rights of artists and cultural workers are preserved. It will be working in collaboration with regional institutions, including the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization and the African Intellectual Property. The fifth one is the African Export and Import Bank Initiative. The AUC is currently discussing and negotiating with Afrexim Bank to provide financial scheme to artists. The bank has also recently established an advisory creative economic committee to which Her Excellency Amira El Fadil, the Commissioner for Social Affairs, is one of the co-chairs. Those inaugural meeting will take place in the coming week. The aim of the Creative Economic Advisory Committee is to promote the development of these important sectors. We have also various engagements with producers of art and with cultural and creative industries institutions on the continent and beyond. We regularly engage with various producers of art content since, as you are aware, as a policy-making institution, our main role is to develop draft policy instruments. Some of these institutions are All African Music Award, the Pan-African Festival of Ouagadougou, to which we provide a prize for a film on a culture for peace since 2013. The Pan-African Festival of Music, FESMAN, and the Pan-African Festival of Dance. In a nutshell, these are the AU main intervention in the cultural and creative economic sector. Allow me to conclude with a word of appreciation to the paramount role that artists and cultural workers are playing in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Their role in passing key messages about this deadly pandemic, as well as disseminating prevention measures, cannot be overemphasized. Art have spread no effort to use their art to reach out the people of the continent about the coronavirus pandemic. I would like also to use this opportunity to thank AU member states who have assisted artists by developing contribution schemes so that they continue producing art during this difficult time. The AUC held a virtual platform ministerial responsible for art, culture, and heritage in May 2020, and they were able to present and share this initiative. Lastly, I would like to conclude by paying tribute to all those artists that have passed on due to the corona pandemic, and to say that the legacy they leave behind is too powerful and will never forever. I'm here with my colleague Angela Martin, the head of culture, so who is going to follow also our meeting, and I thank you so much.
Thank you very much for giving insight into the activities of the African Union. This was Cisse Mariama Mohamed, Director of Social Affairs at the African Union. From the African Union, we'll go on to the African Development Bank. I'm very happy that Emanuela Gregorio is joining us. Emanuela, can you introduce us to the frameworks of action for culture and creative sectors of the Development Bank? And maybe also, as we have heard, what was mentioned was or what the study talks about is also the need to build confidence in the banking and insurance sectors with the cultural and creative industries. Maybe you can share also some insights and learnings from your experience with that.
Thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Emanuela Gregorio. I'm an economist and I've been coordinating since inception the Fashionomics Africa initiative. Fashionomics stands for the economics of fashion, because the banks sees the cultural and creative industries, and in this specific case, the fashion industry, for its great potential for continents-wide job creation and gross domestic production. We see that there is the need to invest in non-mainstream sectors such as the cultural and creative industries, because there is this the great need of creating jobs which are skilled and unskilled, and also support our regional member countries, which are our shareholders, because we are a development bank, multilateral financial institution, to help them to diversify and boost the intra-African trade. So this is really at the heart of the bank's ambition for the continent. And we started with the fashion industries, but also our aim is to scale up to more subsectors of the cultural creative industries, because it's a capital intensive, labor intensive industry. It helps diversification, it helps to develop local content, it helps to boost regional integration and SME development. So our aim is, through the initiative, is to attract foreign direct investments in the textile, apparel and accessory industry, or also fashion industry. These are all very strictly interlinked among themselves, of course, with the aim to support the downstream activities alongside the value chain. So focusing on micro, small and medium enterprises, with a special focus on youth and women entrepreneurship development. How do we do this? So through, of course, and a strong element which has been also highlighted by the study recommendations is strong partnerships. We work with the public and private sector. As a multilateral development bank, who our shareholders have, as I said before, are regional member countries, and we have two windows, two funding windows, public and private. Through these windows, we provide long-term financing when it comes to the private sector, to support them in their quest for development and industrialization, for example. As an example, I can give you that we have recently invested in Madagascar 10 million to support the growth of the textile industry through special economic zones, and also by setting up a fund to support local SMEs growth, with a focus also 40% to be women owned. And through our private window, for example, we are looking into investment deals, supporting big companies that intend to delocalize or create new factories on the continent to produce textile and apparel goods. So we do that through our private sector window. But coming back to the program, we have different pillars. Is to provide access to markets and market intelligence, facilitate access to finance, not only through traditional financing channels such as commercial banks, but also through innovative financing channels such as crowdfunding schemes, impact in venture capitalism investors. Provide access to capacity building activities and know-how transfer through our Fashionomics Africa master classes. And here again, the strong focus on partnerships. We don't do this alone, but we work also with public and private sector stakeholders. When it comes to our regional member countries, we involve the concerned ministries from trade and industrialization in the pilot countries where we work, but also we work with UN agencies such as UNEP, such as the International Trade Center, Ethical Fashion Initiative, Parsons School of Fashion from New York, DHL, Google, Facebook. So these are all our partners, and they all, based on the expertise, their expertise, they support us in providing capacity building activities for entrepreneurs when it comes to trading online or sustainability and ethical sourcing. We work also with financial institutions and other development institutions such as Trade and Development Bank, Frexim Bank, when it comes again to provide learning how to access to finance, business plan development to make their pitches and business plans more credible towards those that can provide them with financing, such as financial institutions. And also we provide mentorship and networking opportunities. Going back to what you just also asked before is, the issue about access to finance. These industries operate in the informal sectors as many other sectors on the continent. And because of this, and because of the lack of understanding from financial institutions, also due to their cash flow instability, again, informality, and the lack of collaterals that they can provide, there is a market failure, where demand and supply don't meet. So because of this, based on this also, we have developed and designed this program to be able to create an ecosystem where there's not only the access to finance component, which is important, of course, for growth and expansion purposes for these businesses, but there are also the non-financial services which are very important, such as helping them in making their business plan more credible, legal, auditing, and other kind of services that help them again to be able to develop a strong proposal and be able to access to financing. So there is an issue that financial institutions, they don't yet understand these businesses. They are not considered as economic assets as they are, because this is also what the bank, my institution, focuses on. These are economic sectors where culture and creativity are their unique selling point. And we are trying to support them, but also to advocate for the industry and support others to invest in these industries.
Thanks a lot. Just a reminder, we're seeing also the questions that are being asked in the chat box. We're collecting them for the Q&A later. And feel free also to use the chat box to ask your questions. I do want to now turn to Germany. Germany is behind the study in a way. And we have with us Peter Keller from the Foreign Office, Peter Kettner, sorry. So I wonder, how Germany, active in with many different projects, coordinates its activities, not only with other EU member states and the EU, but also amongst itself, as there are also different actors involved in on the continent coming from Germany.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me also say thank you for this great study, which will definitely also help us a lot. As for coordination issue, yes, we have many players from Germany as well as from Europe that are involved in a lot of processes. And actually, what we're trying to do is to look how we can work together in order to create some added value for not only for German foreign policy, but also for the people on the ground. And we have in the current situation, we have the problem, or we see that creative people around the world are struggling for financial survival, and that is something that we're dealing with a lot at that time. And we see that in many of the, so to say, richer countries. This is currently still be met with transfer payments, although we don't know how long this will last. But in a number of other countries, and amongst them sub-Saharan African countries, we see already that there's a lot of financial distress that creative people have, and structures at all levels are at risk, and that is something we're focusing on subsequently, and we see generally a need to focus on promoting structures from today's perspective. You could also say from a need to preserve structures, because preserving them is much easier than to build them up again when they're destroyed. At the same time, we see in Germany that there's a lot of creative people that are in fact seizing the situation to go beyond preserving the structures, and that want to seize the situation also for necessary change in the structures, which also fits very well, as do the findings of the study, in the fundamental ideas and approaches of German foreign policy, which are essentially based on co-production and cooperation. And that goes also within the foreign, within the federal government, meaning with other players like the Ministry of Finance, like the Ministry of Economic Development. But this is something we are of course looking very closely at, how we can promote networking within the CCI communities, especially in that case in sub-Saharan Africa, but also between the community and in Germany and Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm also very grateful that thankful for the study underlining once again that politics can play a crucial role, because they made this link to the African Union, and they say that administration is a very important player, and we do share this. Generally speaking, I'm happy to see that our approach already addresses many of the report propositions, and which goes for bottom-up programs, which goes for supporting local project managers and strengthening awareness for property rights. We see in our current funding mechanisms that working together with local organizations is a precondition for funding for us, and of course we also we see that this cooperative, co-productive approach is something that also Germany can benefit from. That's the idea, is that both sides are in the end benefiting from this exchange of ideas and views, and that is something we try to transport within the federal government. And that is something that, from my view, is very much supported by the findings of the study. And therefore, once again, thanks for the study, which will help us a lot. And of course, we can always do better, and we will do. Hopefully, we will do better. Yeah, and that's why I'm also very much interested in your questions and in the discussion in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Now let's turn to the European Union, to Brussels. Giorgio Ficcarelli is here. Giorgio, what opportunities do you see for the creative and cultural sectors also to implement the EU strategic approach to international cultural relations? And how can the CCIs become a platform for that implementation? And maybe as a second part of my question, I know that in DG DevCo, you've also been thinking about financing and finding different models of financing for the cultural and creative sectors. And can you share some of your initiatives in that field as well? And maybe what are the success factors, if you can already determine those?
Thank you, Gitte. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to intervene to this interesting debate. Actually, I think it is this study, it came at a really good time, because this is the time we are discussing how to proceed with the new strategy of cultural cooperation and cultural relation between the European Union and the rest of our partner countries. There have been a lot have been done in terms of clarifying our agenda, the importance of the cultural dimension, giving a kind of policy framework, the joint communication. So in these last 4 years, there has been really a recognition of the importance of culture and creativity in our action of cooperation. Now is the moment to see actually how this can be implemented through, and the cultural and creative industries are a key element on this, and we have definitely identified these the stakeholders of the cultural and creative industry as a key element for a real partnership. So it's good, and the focus of the study, it's very welcome. And actually, we see that a lot of the recommendations that are there are coinciding a little bit with our internal strategy, the philosophy that we are applying to the new programs. Because if cultural and creative industry is an important, like Joyce just said, very important economic, is playing a very important economic and social role in terms of creation of jobs, in terms of growth, with a very interesting sector. But on the other side, the role of the cultural and creative industry as an enabler of dialogue and a stimulator of changes is fundamental. So I think the existence of creative industry in a good shape and with possibility to be accessed by the largest part of the population, it's fundamental in my opinion, and also in our new strategy. So that's why, for example, last year when we organized a big colloquium, Culture for the Future, our main objective was really to get together stakeholders, professionals. So we get nearly 500 cultural stakeholders in order to create a kind of constituency from the different continents, from the different countries, and establish links of cooperation, of co-creation, of co-production. This has been concretized from one side to this manifesto of recommendation that has been given to the different institutions involved and can help in this design, but also in the creation of the cultural exchange platform, this LinkedIn, this electronic LinkedIn of creative industry. I think this is very important because I think more the professional will be in contact and we will develop way how to produce together, create together, more real, deeper will go the cultural cooperation between us. So we are hoping that we can push it through even more. The cultural exchange is starting to have more and more participants. We want to, for example, we just have been participating to the film festival in Venice, bringing together a musician from around the world, so also giving a message that digital contacts are important, but we should not resign and get accustomed that we will not have any more mobility of artists or physical contact. I think this is fundamental for our life, and so we have done it with the existing rule of security. We have been able to bring together musicians from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and from Central Asia, for example, to create something new. And it was interesting to see the original music that came out. We are launching a new scheme of co-production of film for the film industry. There again, we have enlarged the scheme in order to have more funds participating, including local funding, local funds like the one on Ivory Coast, but we hope that for the next call we'll have more local funds participating. And then I will go to a key issue that you also identify when you spoke about local needs and local partners. The importance to, and has been growing this the role of the local cultural organization, association, funds. This is fundamental, and that's why we have decided a key change in the implementation of our financially bigger program with the ACP EU Culture Program. That for the first time, we will not use the traditional method of calls from Brussels, but we have identified 6 hubs of consortium of organization that will run the program at local level. So we have 4 hubs in sub-Saharan Africa, in the 4 regions, East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, where we have a consortium of different organizations and they pull together in order to be able to launch and implement and manage the program at local level. This is a key change and I'm particularly proud of this. And I think that will change a lot to the perspective where we need to have more local partners. We also need to speak about local funding. Diversification of funds means also local funding.
Yeah.
So funds should come from Europe, from Africa, from the local region, from the private sector or the public sector. So just to close here the intervention, say that we are speaking with Emanuela of the African Development Bank to put together a new program of Creatify, let's say a financial tool where we can leverage local and private funds in favor of the creative industry. I finish here in order to leave space for the discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been seeing questions come in through the chat box. Kimani and Pedro, there's a longer one for you, I think, coming in from Mike, or 5, 6 actually. So while you read this, I would like to turn to the African Union again. Cisse, there was a question about guidance and direction on creative freedom of expression and any legal support in that direction from the African Union. Can you share if you are working on such programs with us, and if yes, which ones? Cisse, are you still with us? I can see you in the room. Yeah.
Hello. I'm on another meeting. Can I please give the floor to my colleague Angela?
Sure.
Who is going to respond to the questions?
Hello, good morning, everybody. I guess the question was related to the issue of freedom of expression. We don't have such a program per se in that regard, but the Charter for African Cultural Renaissance, which you might be familiar with, has specific provisions on the promotion of the freedom of expression by artists. But the challenge we are facing is that the Charter is not yet in force. We are still mobilizing member states to ratify this cultural instrument. Currently, we have 14 ratifications by member states. We are expecting 1 more ratification for it to enter into force. So once the Charter is in force, we could start engaging our member states in that regard. Also, the other instruments that were mentioned by Madam Cisse, like the Statute on Audiovisual and Cinema, and also the Plan of Action on Cultural and Creative Industries, refer to issues of freedom of expression. But per se, we don't have a program. And as you might be aware, and it was referred to by Madam Cisse also, our main role is to develop policy instruments. So we've been working in developing continental policy instruments in the area of CCIs, and the AU Plan of Action on Cultural and Creative Industries is one of them. And we promote such instruments in the member states. And the main role of the instruments is that they are guides for member states to develop their own policy instruments in this area of cultural and creative industries. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Kimani, Petro, did you have time to look at?
Yes, yes.
Okay, floor is yours.
So the first question, it's about what it's been done by the African governments and other agencies for CCIs internally. So in the introduction of each section of the study, we dedicated a space exclusively to talk about the local framework. What is the local context? What is the local agenda? What are government doings? What are the legislations and main programs? And we have perceived again that there are some countries, the hub countries, as we are calling them, for instance, South Africa, Kenya, and so on, that are developing a framework, still very timid to support the sector, but they are far in front of other countries which do not have a good legislation scheme. And we also acknowledge in the study somehow the role of other foundations and institutions that are coming out of the EU scope, mostly, for instance, US foundations that are considered even by the locals as more flexible. But this is room for upcoming researches in the future. The second and the third question dealing with supply side and stimulation of market, stimulation of the market to make the CCIs more sustainable. Indeed, in addition to the main finds that we presented, we found very few programs and projects trying to stimulate the local market, right? And the ones who are doing it, the ones which focus on this aim, they mostly deal with the middle class, the local middle classes or up classes that are supposedly the ones able to consume what is being produced culturally and creatively in these countries. So with this one, I already connect with the fourth question, that it's about perpetuation of reinforcing of economic inequalities, because if we are focusing on a consumption market that it's basically targeting the elites who are going to be the producers and distributors which are going to reach these markets. Let's imagine a craftsman or a craftswoman from the countryside, from a place that is far away from the city centers. How is she or he going to find out a market and have the connection to sell and distribute its production to the main centers? So we need to think more. I would use buzzword now, disruptively, in how do we make bridges and how do we make bridges that do not deepen inequality. How do we deal with these connections so that the producers and distributors, they can have access to local markets, the local markets are going to consume, and the bridge is going to be solid and sustainable. But this is an ongoing challenge, and I don't think we found a program that brings these answers clearly. However, the discussion, it's gaining more and more force. I think we have perceived that in these last 5 years, there is a trend, at least from a programmatic commitment, that it's more aware of what the locals really need and how to get closer to them instead of imposing what the partner in Europe wants to do. We are seeing that this flexibility, and we really hope, we really expect that this will become a common practice instead of a disruptive thing one day.
Kimani, do you want to add maybe just one or two reflections on the input by Mike van Gaan?
Yes, very good questions, actually. Just quick comment that with regard to issues of piracy, piracy is a consequence of the need for people to make some money. And in situations of intense poverty, distributors will try to latch on whatever is available. So I think that really, and we do talk about a little bit about piracy in the report, that this is an ongoing challenge for creative and cultural industries. I think that what is required is the diversity of products that we create and we support, and to recognize that some will be pirated and others will not be pirated. And that in the development of these projects, we factor in the potential of piracy as a factor. Because again, as Mike mentions, there is always that tension between very stringent IP as well as, which tends to limit access. When there's something that's required, the demand is very, very high. People will tend to find shortcuts to access. So it's really in the design and the building of frameworks for Creative Commons, open access, all sorts of possible ways of packaging of our products. And just again, very briefly to say that the markets differ from country to country. If you look at West Africa, fashion, the clothing industry is very strong. In other parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, it might not be the case. So the markets are, differ country by country. But sub-Saharan Africa is 1.2 billion people. So huge possibility for the continent itself to be the main market. So again, how do we nurture it? How do we grow it? So that's, we don't have like final answers, but I think it's a deeper reflection on distribution channels and the markets that is required.
And very, very, very briefly, we also need to think about different models of property rights, intellectual property and property rights. We know that in sub-Saharan Africa, there is this common and shared knowledge and shared ownership on one practice, one on innovation. So how do we benefit not a single person, but a whole community through intellectual property rights, which take into consideration the characteristics of the region as well? This is something very, very crucial to take into consideration.
Thanks. We're now nearing the time slot the end of the time slot that we had foreseen for this webinar. From our side as hosts, we can gladly continue for another 15 or 20 minutes. So feel free to stay, but I also understand if you have to go at this point. Thanks for joining. And if you'd like to be up to date with more webinars as such, sign up for our newsletter. I saw several questions in the chat. There was one about matchmaking and a previous program in the film industry where that might have been foreseen but wasn't. I don't know who would like to take this question. Also from the same person, Mudamba from DocuBox, I think that's also based in East Africa, a question on ACP and how maybe the idea of rooting initiatives locally has not worked out so well. And then we've just had some very practical from the Goethe Institute in Tunisia, north of Africa, on how to really do this, work with local languages. And another question on why cross-regional collaborations by non-native organizations are not happening. So I don't know who would like to go first.
I pick the one on local languages because I kind of feel strongly about this.
You're a linguist.
Yeah, I think that there is a real opportunity, and I think the question says if we factor in local languages in the application process, then we have to factor that throughout the program. I think that in the implementation of many of the programs, local languages are actually used, so that there is some use of those languages during implementation, especially when they are being implemented in the rural areas. But this is not very deliberate. It's not a very intentional process. I think it is very possible to do it, and we can do it progressively. You can start with the regional languages. We do have languages that cut across 3 or 4 countries. Those could be the ones that could be tapped in right away, like Somalia, or Swahili, and so on. Languages that are spoken by 3 or 4, countries. And I think that it is possible to do this. I mean, we work with translation. We work with people with different levels of education and so on. Because if democratization means that our programs are people-centered, then language is really central to that process. And so it's being intentional in the design, and it can be done. I think it really can be done. And again, with regard to mobility, it's again intentionality. So if we are lacking cross-regional collaboration, it's because we are not being very intentional in making that possible. But if we do it intentionally, then it is possible to do that from the beginning. I think maybe our colleagues might have additional comments, but I thought maybe to add on to the whole question of intentionality and democratization of the whole process and carrying as many people with us as we do our work.
Thank you.
Can I make an intervention on that, just to add to Prof?
Please do.
Yeah, no, I think that of course we have been discussing the one side. We've been discussing how the EU side, if I can call it that, can we look at some of these support strategies that have been existent. But I think we also recognize that there's work to be done from the other side, from the so-called partnering side or recipient side. And with regard to what Prof has just shared, I mean, we are part of, right now, an EU funded program that is across 2 countries. It's across Kenya and Somalia. And one of the things that's very clear to us right now is that language is already a barrier. And so while there's a need to put out calls for artists to make application, we have already found that we cannot put it in English. So the Somali counterparts are translating that. And as the organization that is actually offering the training, we are actually now in the process of translating our training into Somali. So these things, I think, are very real. And I think there's a responsibility on both sides to really begin to think about how do we work with with these realities. So both just in terms of the open call that comes out of an EU, for example, but also internally, that the partners who are benefiting from these programs are also recognizing that there's challenges of communication and their own role in beginning to change these.
Thanks, Joy. I just want to refer back to a question that we had earlier, actually about the role of the African Union. As a practitioner, what would be your expectations of such an organism uniting or preparing policy policy instruments that can then be implemented in the member states of the African Union? What's your reaction to that, and maybe also your expectations?
Yeah, I think that working with the African Union is something that has been ongoing, and those who have participated or been part of the arterial network are very much aware that this has been a long journey and continues to be a long journey. I think one of the things that I'm certainly seeing is that as the sector grows and has to engage with government, whether at the level of nation or at the level of the continent, we cannot run away from the reality that this will be slow work. I think we recognize that these are institutions that are slower, that don't get what we are doing half the time, but we cannot disengage or not engage. I would expect that as the sector grows, they become more open to engaging with us. I think that in all of our languages, we probably have a proverb that talks about sustainability, which says that the stick that will kill the snake is your own stick. It's not the stick of the neighbor or the stick of the person in the village next door. And so for me, this stick that kills the snake, which are the challenges of the creative economy, are really the partnerships that we build with those things that are right at home. And those things that are right at home are our governments, our policymakers, including the AU. So while it is difficult, we have to do it. We have to do it. So I expect openness on their side, and I expect a growing awareness and engagement from practitioners all across the continent, not just a few.
Thank you. As we have also the EU present in the meeting, are there any, Giorgio, are there any sort of initiatives to also learn from each other, sort of institutional twinnings, for instance, between the African Union and the European Union, and maybe also in regards to the upcoming AU-EU summit? Is there anything foreseen to sort of streamline cultural engagement between those two institutions? You're muted.
Sorry. Yes, the dialogue with the African Union and the African Commission is a very open one. And of course, now is the preparation of the African Europe Summit is the big agenda, within which we are trying to do various preparatory events, one of which will be a culture forum organized together on the issue of culture and cities, because we have been trying to establish a relation with the African Union and the Commission to see how we can develop more this issue, more and more. The African population is becoming urban, and is within the cities. Then a lot of social issues are more evident. So where the cultural dimension can make a difference. So we would like to organize a forum of 3 days on that, and now I see that Angela Martins is here. So, for example, all the issue of the African capital culture, there have been a lot of talking about. We would like to have the African Union more strongly assuming this issue, because we are receiving more from the UCLG than from the African Union. But we are very much interested to accompany this process. And I think that there is a very interesting opportunity of exchange between the experience of the European capital culture and the starting African capital culture. So we would like to invite various towns to participate to this forum, at least those who are candidates for the African Capital of Culture. And definitely we would like to intensify our works with the African Union, because I think in this case it is very important, their role, and then that politically there is a strong blessing of this new initiative.
Thank you. As we're nearing the end of our webinar,
Gitte?
yes.
There's still a time to talk about the cultural Tinder matchmaking process.
Sure.
We have seen that some of programs now, they have understood the importance of being more proactive as an intermediary between the potential applicant in Europe and the potential applicant in sub-Saharan Africa. But this understanding has showed up to now a kind of timid development. And when we say timid, it's because we believe there is room for a more proactive initiative. For instance, going beyond forums or websites or mailing lists, we have perceived there is room, for instance, for facilitation, that you provide along with your call, a list, a database, for instance, pointing out potential institutions and so on, that you can, for instance, during the process, organize facilitations so that the potential applicants, they can have a call together and kind of through a facilitator will get to know each other, because we can't think of that people will match without an intermediary, without a connection. It will be very rare, and these privileges entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa who have access to connections already. And how about those ones who lack these connections, who lack networks? So how do we make the networks, how do we make the forums, how do we make the mailing lists more proactive? How do we really create bonds? And for this, it's necessary to have enough time. It doesn't work if you open up a call for application for the next 15 days. You need to allow people to get to know, to understand what each other is doing, to build the trust, and then they will feel more confident to apply together. And we believe this increases the chances to have sustainability throughout the process. But if you give them 10, 15 days to know each other, to find each other, to discuss and so on, the friction, it's a risk. So how do we make it more fluid? We believe that the facilitation process plays a very, very important role to make the platform alive.
Thank you. I see Angela has turned on her camera. Angela, would you like to intervene at this point?
Not really, but to say that we have always been open to cultural practitioners on the continent. And we mentioned the review of the AU Plan of Action on Cultural and Creative Industries, and that was done by practitioners on the continent. We created a working group composed of various experts from various sectors in the creative economy, and they were the ones who proposed the revisions to that AU key cultural instrument. Like Mr. Ficcarelli has said, I heard all his initiatives. We worked with him many, many years ago, and we are open to everybody who's willing to work with us. And we are here for the continent. And that's what I wanted to say. I thank you.
Thank you.
I can just add that, Pedro, then this is exactly the role of this cultural exchange platform. And the idea is really to make a practical tool to people to know each other, to multiply the contacts in the different area and in the different sectors, subsector, skills, etc. This is a digital tool, but also one of the function of the six hub that will manage the new ECP culture program will be also facilitating contacts and making people knowing each other. Yeah.
Thanks. I also see an idea that popped up in the chat box from Cisse Mangoma in Zimbabwe to have a webinar with creative economy practitioners across sub-Saharan Africa. If there's a need to connect, as EUNIC, we're happy to offer a platform. We do have the technology to organize these webinars, so why don't you get in touch with us if that's something that other colleagues also see as a good opportunity. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks again to IFA, Institute for Auslandsbeziehungen, Institute for Cultural Relations, for co-hosting this webinar with us and for the study. Thanks Kimani Njogu and Pedro Afonso, the authors of this study, and thanks to all the panelists that have joined us today. Joy Mboya, Giorgio Ficcarelli, Peter Kettner, Angela Martins and Cisse, Mariama, Mohamed, and Emanuela Gregorio, who has already left us at 12 our time, 1:30 here in Brussels due to other engagements. But thanks for this discussion. If you would like to stay in touch, you can find our email addresses on the internet, and also we can connect you to anyone who's been on the panel today. Thanks for your input. And yes, also really happy to see so many familiar names in the participants list. Great to reconnect, and thanks to those colleagues who have also given their contributions in the chat box. Thanks a lot. Stay safe.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
And see you again.
Bye.
Harry. Thank you.